So this is serving diverse audiences with science writing. I'm Emily Conover. I am a member of the board of DUXWA, and I am a reporter at Science News. I think, we've been having in the science writing community a variety of discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think I hadn't really seen any discussions specifically aimed at discussing our audiences. And so I thought it'd be nice to have a dedicated conversation about that. And so we have with us a great slate of panelists to discuss that. So we have Juliet and Beverly. She's the content manager at brainfacts.org. Mónica Feliú-Mójer, who is director of communications and science outreach for Ciencia, Puerto Rico. We have Kim Pearson, associate professor of journalism at the College of New Jersey. And Andrea Wenzel, assistant professor of journalism at Temple University. And I also just want to draw everyone's attention to the code of conduct. So just please be respectful to everyone. So great. With that, I think, let's see. Oh, I should also tell you that we are going to take questions at the end. There'll be a Q&A box. You can put your questions in there. Feel free to put them in the whole time that we're talking as questions come up, but we'll get to those at the end. And so thanks so much to all the panelists for sharing their thoughts with us. We appreciate you being with us. Great, so I wanna start, I'm gonna close my screen share. And I want to start by asking each of the panelists to kind of introduce themselves, talk a little bit about who they are and what they do, and any thoughts that you want to share to kick us off this discussion about audience diversity. So let's see, Juliet, do you want to start us?
Sure. Hi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Juliet Beverly. Thank you for the introduction, Emily. I'm the content manager for brainfacts.org. It's published by the Society for Neuroscience, so we are geared toward a lay-friendly but science-curious audience, and I like to think that the audience is myself. I'm a print journalist by background. I got a BA in print journalism back in the day from Howard University, and fell into science writing much by chance, but it was a great avenue for me to kind of be a nerd, but also understand science. So with that, when I think about science writing and engaging different communities, I always think that it wasn't until I was a young adult before I really saw a Black science writer. It was Warren Leary, actually, at the Embassy of Austria. I was a grown human being and never saw another science writer that looked like myself, and I was just kind of starting out in my career. That said, I do have a couple of quick points to let you guys reflect on as we think about how we engage all kinds of people in science writing and science journalism. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So I'm assuming everyone can hear and see this, but if you can, it says, what are you looking at? These are the areas where, for all of the work that I've done in a decade or more, that I still feel like are areas that we can look at DE&I and reflect about how well we are doing as journalists and as writers. I would like to think that there are certain areas where we can just, home in on and say that that's where all of our bias is and that's where we need to concentrate on. But the realness of it is that we are biased all of the time, and it's something we have to confront. So you can't blame it on the web editor for picking an image that didn't work out. You can't blame it on the editor for, wanting a better SEO headline. you have to actually take accountability. Wherever you're involved, that is where you can confront bias. So that is with yourself. This is a quote from The Craft of Science Writing. I have a copy of it, so I suggest everyone get that. On page 145, there's a passage from Christina Selby about how to engage diverse communities. And I just thought that this is the best place to start, is looking at the man, woman, or other person in the mirror and saying, all right, let's talk about what we know and what we don't know and our prejudice. That said, you probably are sitting or around adjacently a lot of data that is coming in from all places to kind of determine who's doing what. A lot of people don't look at this, and a lot of people don't ask about it. So if you're a writer, you have the benefit of kind of just writing and maybe not asking. So who's going to the story? Who's reading it? There are a couple of places you can look. I would say people overlook the marketing department most often. So try not to bother your marketing department, but it doesn't hurt to ask, like, what do you know about our audience? When we look at our communication, we can always do a lot better at talking about our concerns head on. You can set expectations as an assignment editor about who you want to see in a story. You as a writer can surface those voices you want to hear. There's no reason that you can't do all this. And journalism is supposed to be a collaborative effort. So, start those conversations with the people you're working with. This also includes staying connected to the communities that you want to reach, and also staying, updated on a lot of those style manuals. That's a great insight into a community. There's so many affinity organizations that there shouldn't be a fear that you're going to not know where to go. There are people out there who want to tell you about themselves and where they come from. And, ask your sources for support. This is a great place to ask your source, hey, do you have any photos? Because honestly, if I don't see myself in a story, I'm probably thinking science is still very white and male. It is, but there are actually a lot more diverse faces and voices out there, and they're not literally being shown. People need to see that. Ask your source, do you have photos of you in the field, of your grad students? I'm surprised about how many Instagram accounts are out there where, it's a grad student just like, I'm posting all these photos. Hey, ask for a few of them, and ask your web editor or your photo department to collaborate a little bit more. These are the easy ways to get into this, but I will leave it there.
Great, thanks for that great intro. Let's see. So Monica, do you want to introduce yourself and start us off with some thoughts?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Good evening or good afternoon. For me, it's still the afternoon. I'm in California. My name is Mónica Feliú-Mójer, and I work with two nonprofits, Ciencia, Puerto Rico, and iBiology. And broadly, they both focus on science communication and science education using a variety of strategies. I'm a scientist by training. I'm a neurobiologist by training, and I kind of fell into science communication by chance. I found science communication as a young scientist, and it really changed my life. And so I decided halfway through my PhD that I would focus on doing this, particularly on using science communication and storytelling to make science more inclusive, more equitable, and representative. Because as a Puerto Rican woman who grew up in rural Puerto Rico, I didn't see myself represented in science or in books or in media. And so my work focuses on, let's say it focuses on three pillars. Everything that I do is in science communication and uses storytelling, but I particularly focus on using culturally relevant science communication to make science accessible and pertinent to communities that have been historically marginalized and even harmed by science. I use culturally relevant science communication to, for example, increase the visibility of scientists from these marginalized backgrounds. I use science communication training to help scientists from these marginalized backgrounds to lift their voice, to find the spaces and sometimes the confidence to speak up, to share their stories, to talk about their science. I use a wide range of media to do this. So I work with journalists a lot, connecting scientists with them for interviews, for consulting. I also train scientists and guide them through opportunities of writing, like writing for newspapers. For example, we have Ciencia, Puerto Rico particularly, we have a collaboration with El Nuevo Dia, which is the newspaper of record in Puerto Rico. And for a long time, I've been working with the newspaper and scientists to help them write about any topic of science that they're interested in for non-expert audiences in ways that, again, are culturally relevant, connecting science to the culture and the reality of mostly Puerto Rican audiences in Spanish. And all of this work, it also feeds into engaging communities. Most recently, I've been focusing on connecting scientists with different communities in Puerto Rico, with educators, with vulnerable communities in Puerto Rico, so that they can collaborate and co-create teaching resources. I recently started a project that's focused on creating a collection of educational resources using an inclusive and participatory science communication model to make sure that the resources we're creating is answering the questions and reflecting the reality of poor people in Puerto Rico, Black people in Puerto Rico, people who are deaf or have hard of hearing. And so everything that I do is really centered around this culturally relevant science communication and bringing scientists into the conversation and helping them engage with non-experts that they normally don't interact with. And so I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks. Let's see, should we go on to Kim?
Thank you. I feel humbled to be among such distinguished and accomplished company. So I'm Kim Pearson. I'm a journalism professor at the College of New Jersey, and my entree into science communication came right after college. I worked for the Fox Chase Cancer Center, the National Cancer Institute, as an information specialist, and a lot of what I did in that job was to write about cancer for lay audiences, for allied health professionals, so that they could, because these were the frontline educators of patients and allies of advocates for patients. And I did a lot of, and I was a lay counselor on a cancer information service line. And I published a newsletter. I worked with social workers. And so that, unbeknownst to me, that began to give me some kind of feeling for diverse audiences and stakeholders in science communication. And then after I went to graduate school, and then I worked for Bell Labs, which during the 1980s. And that's actually, the image behind me is from a story I wrote in 1982 where about radio astronomy. I got to hang out with radio astronomers all night and climb up into radio telescopes and, and things. So that was great fun. And part of what that job gave me an appreciation for is the fact that the story of science and innovation in our country has always been more diverse than has been represented in many of our texts. And that's one of the things that needs to be addressed. And I'm grateful nowadays that we have folks out there like Dr. Anissa Ramirez, the author of The Alchemy of Us, who's starting to tell some of those stories. So, when we talk about culturally relevant science communication, part of the problem is that we have, just as so many other areas of life, we've been miseducated about the history of science and innovation in this country. And then, and we continue to be. So more recently, I've been collaborating with computer scientists and scientists in other areas on building curricula and models of interdisciplinary community engaged collaboration to help improve STEM literacy and particularly computational thinking, particularly among journalism students. And by collaborating with, as I say, with students and faculty in STEM areas and community partners to come up with products that meet information needs in diverse communities. And I'll stop there because I do have some other thoughts, but that's a really brief introduction to me and what I do.
Great, thank you. And last we have Andrea.
Hello, I'm really grateful to be here with all of you and to learn from all of you because I am not a science writer. And I have great admiration for all of you who have been engaging more deeply with this field than I have, but I am looking forward to learning from you. My background, I'm a escapee from journalism. I worked in public radio and international media development for about 15 years before going back for my PhD and crossing over to academia, where I now do research, kind of grappling with a lot of the problems that I encountered when I was in journalism, the kind of the whiteness of public radio and the lack of engagement with communities being one of the areas that I look at. But so my research now focuses mostly on how to try to build better, more constructive relationships between journalists and communities, particularly looking at case studies of communities that have historically been marginalized in some way. I have a book I just put out called Community-Centered Journalism that looks at different case studies around the US, looking at examples of local journalism projects that try to use a combination of either solutions journalism or engaged journalism or both to try and engage with their communities. And just, and I'm not sure if folks are, I don't want to throw around jargon. So solutions journalism in a nutshell is just the idea that journalists have a responsibility not only to report on problems, but also to look at what are efforts being done to address problems and critically report on those. And so that's one area I've been focusing on, and the other is engaged journalism, which means many different things to many people. But I think of it mostly as efforts to try to strengthen the connection between journalists and communities by involving communities in the journalism process in some way. And so I make a case for, in the book, by looking at these different examples and then trying to collaborate on some engaged research with some community stakeholders and some local journalists, make an argument for what I call community-centered journalism, which is, it's basically just journalism produced with and for communities, not about communities necessarily. So often I think we have journalism produced about communities, but not for or with them. And also journalism that centers both community information needs, but also the assets that are in communities. And so that's sort of what my focus has been recently. I also do research looking at different diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, both in newsrooms and trying to connect with communities. I've been working with cases in Philadelphia mostly, because that's where I am right now, with the public radio station here and the Philadelphia Inquirer at the moment, but kind of trying to look at how they're attempting to look in their own houses and make things, address problems and challenges within their teams, but also thinking about how they engage with communities that they're working with or they're, you know, intending to cover or engage with. So that's, I'll leave it there in my rambling state, and I apologize in advance if I have to disappear. It's because I have a baby who tends to wake up at inopportune moments like this. So hopefully all will be well, but apologies if I disappear.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of you for those introductions. So I wanted to start out with something that, you know, several of you have sort of alluded to already, which is that, you know, science has a long history of racism and of treating, you know, certain groups of people poorly. It is also, you know, people of color are underrepresented in science. And of course, we are writing about science as science writers. So how do we do this in a way that engages these communities that have been marginalized by science and are, and how do we do this in a way that respects these communities? I don't know who wants to start us off on this.
Well, I'll start. You know, one of the things that I think we need to think about is that if you read the science communications literature, it tends to talk about people who are not white males as if they are members of, as if they have deficits that have to be remedied, you know. And one of the things, I'm glad that this panel is called Serving Diverse Audiences as opposed to Reaching Diverse Audiences, which is what way the language tends to be, which it sort of implies that these people out, these benighted people need us to come save them. And I would submit to you that there are audiences out there where people are having science conversations that in some cases pretty well-informed science conversations and enthusiastic science conversations, but they aren't necessarily the conversations that we're measuring. And, you know, the natural hair care community is one example of, you know, the folks around, you know, Curly Nikki has a book, just The Science of Hair. And you can get into, you know, in that community, you can see intense conversations about chemistry and biology. You know, Dr. Rashida Likely has built curricula around that. And, you know, this is the type of thing that then people who get into the science are also concerned about the cancer risk associated with certain treatments and the ethics. And, you know, it builds into a far long or wide-ranging conversation. So let's, you know, let's look at where audiences are. Similarly, conversations around nutrition. Similarly, conversations around hidden figures. You know, there are all sorts of ways. I would look at to the example of groups like the National Medical Association and the outreach that they've done around COVID and the ways in which they are, you know, reaching out to churches, reaching out to various community spaces. The Black doctors in Philly who've set up COVID testing sites and doing a lot of you know, education through that. I think we can emulate that, and, you know, using the kind of research methods that folks like Andrea have pioneered. So you know, that's where I'd like to see us go.
Yeah, and I'll build upon what Kim just said. You know, many of these marginalized communities, they're talking, minoritized communities, they're talking about science, they're just not calling it science. You know, your reference about the science of hair made me think about, you know, I grew up in a rural community, and the wisest person that I remember knowing as a kid was this old guy who I grew up in a farm, and he used to like come and help with our cows and harvest fruits and vegetables, and like he knew everything there was to know about plants around us. And, you know, he could look at the sky and say, it's going to rain in 3 hours, and it was sunny. And I'd be like, how do you know? But lo and behold, it would rain 3 hours later. And so, you know, I think we have to keep in mind, what are we defining as science, and based on whose values and whose culture? You know, I think we also have to keep in mind that it's not just science writing or science communication that has a racist history, but science has a racist history, society has a racist history. So some of the issues that make science communication and science writing not diverse, and that keep us away from that focus on serving communities, are systemic problems that go beyond science writing. So I think being aware of that and becoming familiar with the history. The other thing that I will say, so before I move on, there is the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Learning, CASE. If you're on Twitter, they're at Informal Science. They have a series of briefs and resources that are called, I think it's called Broadening Perspectives in STEM, to broaden participation in STEM. And they have some documents and guides to help you think about, you know, what is science, based on whose values and ideas are we defining that science. And so if you're interested, I would recommend you check them out. And the last thing I'll say is that we need to start thinking and keep in mind about the colonial history of science, that colonial nature of science, of, you know, there's most often a Western white perspective on science. And, you know, the number of times that I've seen, you know, research in natural history where Western, often white scientists say, we've discovered this species, or we've observed this thing. And then you talk to indigenous communities and they're like, we've known that forever, but thank you for discovering it. So keeping in mind that colonial history of science and working to decolonize our approaches. And if you're interested in this, I would recommend that you look at, there's a list called Decolonizing Science by Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. So if you just Google that, there's a great list to get you started in thinking about how to colonize science.
Great. Anybody else have thoughts they want to share on that?
I think I'll just add that, you know, science, like journalism, has a lot to reckon, not just in 2020, but the part that it's played in upholding the institutions of racism. And that is a lot to do on deadline, and it's a lot to do in any story of, you know, 800 words or less. But it is really up to you to actually see it and acknowledge that it exists. This is the first and foremost way to actually start engaging with people in the community, because there is a trust issue. There is a trust issue, you know, if I gloss over what eugenics is. Why should any reporter think that that's okay? Why should any editor edit that out? So, you know, it's really about not engaging with the matrix of racism. And, you know, a lot of our institutions are just built on it.
Yeah. Well, I think I wanted to pivot a little from what you said. So from talking about the racism of science to the racism of journalism, or the lack of diversity that we have in science writing and in, you know, in journalism in general. What is that? You know, obviously this is something you could have a whole panel about, and people have many times. But I'm just wondering as to how that relates to the diversity of our audiences. What do you see the impact of the lack of diversity in the science writing community or in journalism to be on that?
Well, I think looking at gender is probably a good case study. when I first was starting in science writing, I did not see a lot of women science writers. And I think, you know, in the last decade, there's been more of a push to make sure that we are talking about women who do science. There are plenty of them. I think it's an interesting connection to look at, you know, women who have left the bench to become science writers because the climate wasn't tolerable. I think it's also interesting to look at how many people left science writing or journalism altogether because the climate wasn't tolerable. All of these things actually relate to how you develop content, and a lot of it has to do with who you've decided to tell stories about. If you decide to tell stories about women in science, you might actually end up influencing the field of science. And I think that's vice versa. This is not like new things that I'm saying here, but it seems to be very hard to have a lot of folks absorb. And I think Monica actually articulated this very well. You know, just the nature of looking at decolonization is probably, you know, a great place to actually look at your content as well. So I think in addition to all of the work that it takes to build a story, this should also be part of how you build a story. This is just good journalism practice.
Okay, great. Andrea, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. You know, as you said, you'd worked in this area before, on the sort of the lack of diversity in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I was just about to paste into the chat a couple of, as Juliet was talking, it made me think of two resources you want to check out. Candace Callison and Mary, now I'm going to butcher her name. I'll put it in the thing. But there's a book called Reckoning that kind of gets at questions around decolonizing journalism and calling for sort of a reflexive turn in journalism in a similar way to how anthropology went through this in the 80s and like before. But there's so many parallels between the need for that sort of reckoning in journalism as with science. And obviously, yeah, I mean, looking inside the newsroom for how, I'm having a brain freeze. I just remembered the other resource I was going to share is, as Juliet was talking, Carla Murphy has a study about people leaving journalism. That is another interesting resource that you might want to check out. It's called Leavers, and I'll put that in the chat as well. But just looking at, you know, the challenges that so many journalists of color have had with, not particularly at the mid career mark, staying in and feeling that their work was being rewarded and that they were being given opportunities, and just so much is lost when they have left in journalism across the board. So I'll stop my rambling for the moment and share those resources with you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think when I think in my own work, and you know, I do a bunch of different things. I write, I produce videos, but when I'm thinking about any piece of communication that I am producing, one thing that I think about is our perspectives. Is, you know, what are the perspectives that are represented, and what are the perspectives that are missing from whatever piece I am doing. And in thinking about perspectives that are represented in a piece is not just who I'm representing, but how they're being represented. A few years ago, I produced a series of short films about scientists of color and really trying to flip the narrative of deficit that often surrounds people like me. It's like, oh, you overcame all of these challenges and became a scientist, or became a whatever, insert the blank. And I wanted to tell the stories of how people of color, their cultural backgrounds, their experiences, sure, some of the barriers that they've had to overcome, how that fuels their excellence. And there was one of the people that I profiled, his name is Esteban Bouchard, and he does research in health disparities, but he's also Mexican American. He used to be a wrestler, and so he has that wrestler's build. And so I was doing research about him. I remember finding this article that the whole first paragraph was about, there 4 times, every single sentence in that first paragraph said how angry he was about different things. And I just remember being like, what is this? And so as I was producing these short films about him, I was intentional about going very much against that angry Latino stereotype in this article. And so, you know, thinking about not just who, but how, also thinking about your own perspectives, like my own perspectives as a Puerto Rican and as a Latina woman informed how I approach the storytelling. But I was always trying to be aware of what were the shortcomings of my perspectives, because I'm looking at things from what I know. What are the things that I don't know? How do I educate myself and not ask others to educate me? And then, you know, in terms of, I think, of representation of journalists, this is not a science example, but something that comes to mind is after the election, there's been so much conversation about the Latino vote. And people being like, oh my God, the Latinos, they didn't all vote for X or Y. And it's like, get with the program, people. Latinos are not just one group of people. There are different groups of people. And I saw many journalists, Latino journalists, being like, where have you been? Why are you not listening? This is why you need us in the newsroom and informing the storytelling. And I think for me, that really captures why it is important that we have these perspectives in newsrooms and in journalism spaces.
Yeah, it really matters who's in the room when editorial decisions and priorities are set. And I think about particularly issues that I really am just beginning to see surfacing in the popular press now, not to the degree that it should be. Issues like race correction in medicine, where that is having a real impact on people's lives and has been for decades. Where I can't, if there were enough journalists of color, women, people from diverse communities addressing these conversations, addressing these issues, when these editorial, I can't believe that would not have been elevated long before now. People have been dying and not getting disability compensation that they should be having because of technology that's been created using racist algorithms, okay, that disqualify them from treatment. And it's unconscionable. It's absolutely unconscionable. And, we have a resurgence of phrenology, coming back into technology and in these facial recognition algorithms. I mean, somebody sits in a room and thinks that this is a good idea, that this is good research to fund and that this is something to publicize, And so, I mean, I think that this is, this is an imperative, and it should be a priority for not, for every science, communications organization, but also for every organization that does science, and every medical journal. You look at who's on the masthead of these journals, so.
Yeah, these are all very good points that you're making. I wanted to go to something that you put in the chat, Kim. So you mentioned the idea of news organizations collaborating with community partners and researchers. Could you talk a little bit about what kinds of partnerships you're describing?
Well, Andrea is the real expert on this, and she's, but I can give you a couple of small examples. So I've been involved in 4 National Science Foundation funded projects that work on this model of interdisciplinary collaborations, largely interdisciplinary computing collaborations with community partners. And so, for example, we've partnered with the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example, to analyze patterns in gun violence. We have partnered with Habitat for Humanity to create software tools to make it easier for them to understand the levels of pollution in the neighborhoods where they were considering, rehabilitating houses. Because a lot of the pollution in cities like Trenton, New Jersey, is in properties that, where the polluters left, in the 1920s, but there's still lead and cadmium in the soil, and there've been houses and things built up on top of it, and it's not sitting in a DEP or EPA database. And so, a lot of this has come about by, going to communities and asking them about their information needs and then trying to build from that. So there are a lot of, I put a link in the chat to an article, an essay that I wrote over the summer about building interdisciplinary collaborations that, that could be designed in a way to bring an awareness of racial justice across disciplines, and to engage with communities. So, but as I say, Andrea has done really, really good work on this. So,
yeah, Andrea, do you want to weigh in on this too?
Sure. I mean, for me, the projects I've been looking at try to use what I've been calling a community-centered journalism process. Basically, it's like Kim alluded to, thinking about what are the information needs and assets of a community and going to them and finding that out. And working then with community members so basically, like, I think of it as sort of a 3-step process. So you find a way of finding out information needs and assets, and you do that collaboratively as much as possible. And then connecting the people who you were talking with local journalists, with different community stakeholders, and sharing what you learned, and using that as a way of saying, okay, you've raised some concerns, what can we do about them? What kinds of projects can we co-design to respond to them? And then piloting those and seeing how they go. So just to be a little bit more concrete, because that's a bit vague, in one neighborhood in Philadelphia where we did a research study about what people's information needs were, what assets they had, in terms of communication assets. People shared with us, we have a really vibrant community. This is a community called Germantown, and it's a majority Black community in Philadelphia with very wide socioeconomic backgrounds, and it's a very historic community. But it's a community that people shared that they mostly felt stigmatized and only covered for crime stories. And so they we have a lot of resources here, we have a lot of organizations, but we're not necessarily all connected to each other. So we have a need for that. And we also have a need to combat the narratives being told about our community. And so after doing this study, we worked with community members to design a project called the Germantown Info Hub, where we work with community members to report some of their own stories. And we have media partners, including like the public radio station, where if they do reporting about the community, we'll bring them in to have accountability conversations about the reporting that they've done. And trying to kind of create feedback loops between newsrooms and the community. So that's just sort of an example of, one of the kinds of processes that, or one of the kinds of projects that can grow out of doing a process where you find out the information needs, you collaborate with the community to do something, and then kind of see how it goes and adjust it and adapt it as need be. And I can share a few links of other examples in here too.
Great. Do we have any other thoughts on that from the other panelists? Okay, I'll move on then. So let's see. You know, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea that a lot of scientists have and a lot of journalists have in common, which is the idea that we can and should be totally objective. And I think that this idea has sort of fallen out of favor a little bit recently. And of course, what a lot of you have been talking about is kind of, I mean, we've been talking about the different perspectives, right, that people have. So I think, you know, I think that this idea, you know, can kind of serve as an excuse sometimes to just say, I'm just going to write about what I want to write about. But so I'm just curious, you know, what you all think about these ideas and how they've affected our ability to reach audiences. Of various sorts.
I'm going to start because, I mean, anybody, I deal with this with scientists a lot because I work with scientists a lot. Any scientist that tells you that they're fully objective, pardon my French, it's bullshit. Nobody is fully objective because we're all human and humans have biases. And so you can't be 100% objective. Therefore, science is not 100% objective. And so we have to accept this so that we can address those biases. If we, it's like, you know, when people say, oh, I'm colorblind, bullshit. Nobody's colorblind. Like saying that you're colorblind is actually disrespectful. And I could go further, but I'll stop there.
I appreciate the passion.
I think the only thing I could say in response to that is preach, because it's this weird notion that I think is still based in all of these isms, race being one, because that's, you know, a hot topic, but also in gender or in sexuality. Human beings have the capacity for multiple intersections. Asking someone to dismiss those is inherently wrong, and it's a cruelty to anyone to even suggest that they do so. These are the things that people are bringing to the table when we ask them for their perspective, when we ask them to do good work, when we ask them to be the best journalists that they can be, is bringing in these lenses. And, you know, I don't know how many of you guys have a camera, but like, I honestly would never take the telephoto lens off of my camera and go out and shoot with just that. So why on earth would you ask me to stop being Black or being a woman when I come into the newsroom? These things actually help me build a story. They help me ask these questions. So, you know, again, when I mentioned earlier in my slide, you know, look at yourself, everyone should look at you. The color blindness, you know, that's ridiculous. I think Kim Kardashian said, you know, in her home, there's no color. I think somebody helped her on Instagram realize that there is, and that it's okay to look different, and it's okay for other people to recognize you and who you are and everything that you come with. These build good stories, and this builds trust. These are the people that you want to talk to when a reporter comes into your community. So let's get rid of it. All you journalism professors, stop saying it. Just let's stop it today before we go into 2021. Make it a resolution.
So there's a lot of good scholarship on the fact that the history of, you know, the concept of objective journalism never was objective. I mean, in theory, ideally, it's objectivity and method, but even there, David Mendich's work, Lewis Raven Wallace has a book that's a good synthesis of all of this. It was rooted in a notion that said that it was white men who were most capable of being analytical and dispassionate. You know, that notion of scientism, and this is the reason why Ida B. Wells's journalism was dismissed, and she was called the nasty mulattress. So that's already a problem. It's also, journalistic objectivity is a problem when covering science, because we fall into this problem of false balance. We don't understand that when the weight of scientific research moves toward a consensus on something, then there is no, but on the other hand, there are people who believe the earth is flat, that rather what we're talking about when we talk about wanting to be balanced, wanting to be fair, we're talking about what belongs in the sphere of acceptable controversy, as Daniel Hallen would say, and what belongs in the sphere of consensus, what belongs in the sphere of deviance. And for a long time, what belonged in the sphere of acceptable controversy, well, first in controversy was considered acceptable to debate whether or not, as a Black woman, I'm inherently, stupid and hypersexual, and so on and so forth. That was considered legitimate science and worthy of research. That belongs in the sphere of deviance. We're not going to have that conversation as far as I'm concerned, but it keeps coming back. And we have to acknowledge that. The problem is in too many newsrooms, and for too long, folks are not, and I would say for too many scholars, they don't know their history. We don't know our history. And so there are so many things that we accept as objective. The Uniform Crime Report, for example, we don't know the history of that. And we accept these things as objective. We accept them as racially neutral or neutral with regard to class, et cetera. And we don't know where this stuff comes from. And we need to fix that. And that's the job that's on us as professors.
I would just plus one to what everyone has already said, basically. But I totally agree that objectivity is not only not possible, but it's harmful, and it has a history of doing harm to so many communities. And you mentioned Lewis Raven Wallace's work, and there's a number of others. A number of researchers have found that how it's usually interpreted ends up, overrepresenting white men and creating a reason to, or giving a justification for keeping a distance from communities. And in the work that I do looking at community engagement, that's a real problem, because you'll have people in the newsroom who want to do more engaged strategies, and they'll have editors who are like, oh, that's advocacy journalism, and then it goes back to this cycle of objectivity. But yeah, so I would just add on to that.
I also want to just follow up because, we had a question that was posed to the panelists about, if not objectivity, then what? There's still the matter of actually getting different perspectives. That's actually part of your job as a journalist. Not every story is going to be able to fit, again, into these 500-word blocks. But, as a practical matter, like if you're pitching a story and it needs more context, why aren't you also pitching your editors, hey, I think I'm going to need some more words. What if I did this explanatory piece over here? You can finesse this and actually get paid too. So I feel like, if you want to do the work, you can. Don't make an excuse though. You can get these different perspectives and not go into this hole of, I must be an objective robot. Robots are still built by biased people.
Okay, well, we've got only a few minutes left, so I want to make sure we get some questions from, we've been doing some question answering right now in the chat, but there is a question in the chat from Ariel Hansen about Indigenous ways of knowing. I wondered if, Monica, you would want to answer that question. It's kind of a long question. Maybe I'll post it in the chat for everyone to see.
Let's see. So the question is, could you speak to the intersection of the global science community and those Indigenous approaches, and how to address them as a student and practitioner of science journalism? How can we bridge those gaps in a way that is valuable to both communities? I will say I'm no expert in traditional ways of knowing. I have the privilege of interacting with a lot of Indigenous and Native American scientists through my work with the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, SACNA. So I suggest that you look them up. And, you know, I think whenever I am working with a community that, you know, it's not my own, I think a lot about what are the privileges that I hold. You know, I am well aware that I am a white passing Latina. Unless I open my mouth when I walk into a room where I show my face somewhere, people think I'm white, and that gives me a lot of privilege. And so I'm often thinking about, how do I leverage my privileges to educate myself? And how do I leverage my privilege to listen to those communities and to find ways to put those privileges in service of those communities? So I would say, you know, look at, there's an association of Native American journalists, and I've seen they have some publications on like how to work with Indigenous communities, how to write about. So I would encourage you to Google those. But, you know, start learning. As Juliet said earlier in the chat, Google is a great place to start. And, you know, I'm on Twitter, and I use Twitter to find a lot of these voices that I'm normally not interacting with. And there's some really great Indigenous journalists and Indigenous scientists on Twitter. So following them, there's a list called I think it's called Natives in STEM. And so that's a great place to start.
I'd just like to recommend Ramesh Srinivasan's book, Whose Global Village? And he's a technology, and one of the case studies in that book is, you know, working with a Zuni community that wanted to keep track of where their sacred objects were. Many of their sacred objects had been stolen and put into Western museums. And as he started to understand how the Zuni organized knowledge, he realized that the way that Westerners build databases doesn't make any sense for them, and ended up completely rethinking how to organize that information. And so that was greatly humbling. I want to clarify something too, because there's a back and forth between me and Mitch about objectivity and journalism. My point about the history of objectivity in journalism is that it hasn't been objective. and so what I'm talking about, and I think what we're talking about, is how do we move closer to the ideal that we say that we want, which is to provide the best available version of the truth. And listening to these unrepresented voices, uncovering knowledge that's been suppressed, and becoming attuned to blind spots, and respecting that there are other ways of knowing, are all ways of getting closer to something, you know, a more perfect, a more, a better available version of the truth. Yeah. So.
Okay, great. Well, there's been a lot of conversation in the chat, but I think most of the questions have kind of been answered at this point. And we're right up on 8 o'clock. So does anyone have any sort of closing thoughts they want to share as we let people go about this topic and how to move forward?
I would just say in closing, you know, aim to be authentic, and also aim to do your homework. You know, I mentioned Google before in chat, but, you know, when we don't know things, there are great reputable sources out there that you can do some preliminary work and then do the work on yourself. And then you can be that person that you need to be, you know, going into spaces that might be very new to you, or going into communities that you're from and looking at things at a different way. And, you know, it starts with you from your seat. I know we're all quarantined, but, you know, anyone who has Wi-Fi access right now, you also have access to them too. So technically, a wider world has opened for you.
Great. Anyone else?
I just want
I co-sign what Juliet has said.
Yeah, I absolutely, amen to everything that all of my fellow panelists have said, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Great.
Oh, one thing, actually, I thought of something. One thing that I will add is that in doing this work and this learning, you will mess up. It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. And so be okay with that. It's gonna be uncomfortable. And so learn to sit with that discomfort and, you know, use that discomfort to learn. And again, to educate yourself, to not expect that, especially people that have been marginalized and minoritized are gonna do the education for you. So be okay with the discomfort. Use that as a learning opportunity and just educate yourself.
Great. Well, thanks everyone so much for all your thoughts. I really appreciate it, and I know everyone watching does too. So great. Someone has asked where they can access the links in the chat, so I will make sure to share those. There will be a recording of this panel available on YouTube, and I will try to copy and paste all the links that have been shared here and make them available with that recording as well. So great. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening and keep thinking about this stuff.
Thank you.